Isabel "Izzy" Moreau adjusted the faded green jacket around her as she entered Crestwood Academy, her fourth new school in only 2 years. The jacket, worn soft with age, was a comfort, a constant in her ever-shifting life. Her mother's job as a traveling nurse meant constant moves, and Izzy had learned early that blending in was the easiest way to survive the transition. At 16, she was slim and wiry, with bright auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and observant hazel eyes that missed nothing, even as they seemed to remain distant. The halls of Crestwood throbbed with the usual teenage chaos of slammed lockers and hurried conversations. Izzy navigated the throng with practiced ease, keeping her head down and her worn messenger bag close. She had already mentally mapped the school on her first day, noting the best escape routes and the quiet corners where she could sketch undisturbed. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," a voice sneered from behind, near her assigned art locker. Izzy didn't need to turn to recognize the sound of impending trouble. She'd heard that same tone at Northwood and at Briarcliff. It was the sound of her carefully constructed peace about to be shattered. The voice belonged to Brianna Bree Harding, a husky senior with platinum blonde hair and a sneer that suggested she had never faced any genuine adversity. Bree was surrounded by her usual entourage, Kayla Jenkins, tall and slender with a cruel grin that rarely faded, and Jasmine "Jazz" Davis, shorter but powerfully built, her knuckles bearing the marks of past altercations. They were the undisputed queens of Crestwood's social scene, confusing fear with loyalty and using their money and influence to control their domain. "New girl thinks she's too cool for school," Bree continued, closing the distance until Izzy could smell the artificial coconut of her tanning lotion. "That's not very polite, is it, ladies?" Izzy concentrated on the lock combination, her fingers steady despite the rising tension in her back. She knew the drill. The key was to deny them what they sought, a reaction, a show of fear, most importantly, a justification to escalate. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly comprehend, was that Izzy had spent the last 3 years learning Krav Maga at a self-defense studio in different cities. Her mother's constant travel had exposed her to a world where self-reliance was essential, and Izzy had discovered a talent for defensive combat that both fascinated and disturbed her. "I'm talking to you, Greenie," Bree said, shoving Izzy hard enough that she stumbled against the cold metal of the lockers. The sound reverberated through the hall, causing other students to glance nervously before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted to cross Bree and her crew. Izzy straightened slowly, her hand still resting on her locker door. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Just need to get my supplies." Kayla giggled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the din. "Listen to her, ladies. Just need to get my supplies," she mocked in a sing-song voice. "Are you even old enough to be here?" Jazz moved to Izzy's other side, effectively trapping her against the lockers. "We heard you're from Seattle," she said, deliberately cracking her knuckles. "Big city girl, huh? Well, this is a small town, and we make the rules here. You get what I'm saying?" Izzy nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on the lock. Inside her chest, she felt her pulse slowing, her breathing becoming shallow and controlled. These were the instinctive responses she'd trained herself to cultivate before a confrontation, but she tamped them down. Fighting here would lead to questions, investigations, and potentially legal trouble. More importantly, it would mean her mother finding out about the self-defense classes, something Izzy had hidden for years. "Good," Bree said, patting Izzy's cheek in a gesture designed to humiliate. "Now here's how things are gonna work. Every day, you're gonna give us whatever spending money you've got on you. Think of it as a welcome tax. And on Mondays, you're gonna do our art projects for us. Painting, drawing, whatever we need. Got it?" Before Izzy could respond, the warning bell blared and the hallway began to clear as students hurried to their first classes. Bree's crew stepped back, but the message was clear. This was just the opening act. The rest of the morning was a blur of awkward introductions and strained participation in classes where Izzy tried to fade into the background. During lunch, she found a secluded spot on the library floor, unwrapping the bagel her mother had packed and pulling out a well-worn sketchbook. She'd discovered that having something to draw made her look busy and less approachable, although it rarely deterred them for long. "Well, well, well," Kayla's voice interrupted her concentration. "If it isn't our new little helper." Izzy looked up to see all three of them approaching her spot, carrying lunch trays and wearing identical smirks that promised trouble. The library was filled with students, but Izzy could already see them averting their eyes, pretending not to notice the impending conflict. "Mind if we join you?" Bree asked, not waiting for an answer before sliding into the space next to Izzy. Kayla and Jazz flanked her on either side, their presence instantly making the small space feel confined and menacing. "Actually," Izzy began, starting to stand up. "Sit down," Jazz said sharply, her hand clamping down on Izzy's shoulder and forcing her back to the floor. "We're not done talking." Bree reached over and picked up Izzy's bagel, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Everything bagel," she announced to her friends. "How original. I was getting tired of the cafeteria pizza anyway." She took a large bite, chewing slowly while maintaining eye contact with Izzy. Crumbs fell onto the carpet between them, and Bree made no effort to clean them up. It was a calculated display of disrespect, designed to establish dominance in the most primitive way possible. "You know what I think?" Kayla said, leaning back on her hands. "I think our friend here needs to understand her place in the pecking order. This isn't Seattle, sweetheart. You can't just waltz into our school and expect to be treated like you belong." Izzy felt her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain composed. In the self-defense studio, she'd learned to analyze opponents, to recognize their motivations and vulnerabilities. Bree was the archetypal alpha bully, craving constant reassurance of her power. Kayla was the instigator, the one who pushed situations towards violence. Jazz was the enforcer, the muscle who did the actual dirty work. They operated as a unit, feeding off each other's energy and arrogance. "Look," Izzy said carefully, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get through school." "Trouble?" Bree laughed, finishing Izzy's bagel and wiping her hands on Izzy's sleeve. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly." "Right, ladies." She nodded to Jazz, who immediately reached over and knocked Izzy's sketchbook out of her hands. The book hit the floor and slid under a nearby table, pages fluttering open. "Oops," Jazz said with mock sincerity. "Butterfingers." Izzy started to get up to retrieve her sketchbook, but Kayla's foot shot out, blocking her path. "Where you going, Greenie?" Lunch break isn't over yet. The nickname stung more than Izzy wanted to admit. Throughout her time at the self-defense studio, she'd earned respect through her skill and dedication. Instructors praised her form, sparring partners feared her, and she'd even won a few local tournaments. But here, she was just Greenie, an insignificant target who could be bullied without consequence. "Please," Izzy said, her voice still quiet, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Just let me get my book." Bree leaned forward, her elbows on the floor. "Say, please, Queen Bree," she demanded. "Show some respect." The library seemed to grow quieter around them, other students sensing the tension but unwilling to intervene. Izzy could see a few librarians at the far end of the room, but they were engrossed in their work and oblivious to the drama unfolding near her. Izzy closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself the way her instructor had taught her. In the self-defense studio, there were rules, codes of honor, that even the most aggressive fighters respected. What was happening here was different. It was systematic degradation designed to erode her sense of self-worth. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that could destroy someone who didn't have the tools to defend themselves. But Izzy did have those tools. She just couldn't use them. "Please, Queen Bree," she said finally, the words tasting like bile in her throat. "Let me get my book." Bree's grin widened. "That's better. See, ladies, she can learn." She nodded to Kayla, who moved her foot. Izzy quickly retrieved her sketchbook, checking the pages for damage as she returned to her spot. The spine was creased, but it was still usable. "Same time tomorrow, Greenie," Bree said as the three of them stood up. "And don't forget about our little agreement. We'll be expecting that welcome tax." They walked away laughing, leaving Izzy alone on the floor with the remains of her lunch scattered around her. She sat there for several minutes, staring at the crumbs Bree had left behind, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes that had watched her be humiliated without offering help. The afternoon classes dragged by with Izzy unable to concentrate on anything but the encounter in the library. She'd dealt with bullies before, but never with such a deliberate and persistent approach. Bree's crew wasn't just looking for a momentary power trip. They were establishing a long-term system that would keep Izzy under their control for the remainder of the school year. As the final bell rang, Izzy gathered her books and headed for her locker, hoping to avoid another confrontation. But as she turned the corner into the main hallway, she saw them waiting for her. Bree was leaning against the lockers with her arms crossed, while Kayla and Jazz stood near the exit doors. They'd positioned themselves perfectly to intercept her, no matter which way she tried to leave. "Time to pay up, Greenie," Bree called out as Izzy approached. The hallway was emptying quickly as students rushed to catch buses or head to after-school clubs, leaving Izzy with fewer potential witnesses. Izzy reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, her lunch money for the week. She held it out without making eye contact, hoping the exchange would be quick and painless. Bree snatched the money and examined it with theatrical disappointment. $10? That's it? Come on, Seattle. I know you've got more than this." "That's all I have," Izzy said truthfully. Her mother worked hard to make ends meet, and she'd learned to stretch every dollar. "Check her bag," Kayla suggested with a cruel smile. "Maybe she's hiding something." Before Izzy could protest, Jazz grabbed her messenger bag and dumped the contents onto the floor. Books, notebooks, art supplies, and personal items scattered across the polished tile. Other students walking by stepped around the mess without pausing, their eyes carefully averted. "Look what we have here," Bree said, picking up a small photograph that had fallen from one of Izzy's textbooks. It showed Izzy with her arm around her mother, a snapshot taken during a rare weekend off. "Oh, how touching. She carries pictures of Mommy." Izzy felt a cold knot form in her stomach as Bree held the photo up for Kayla and Jazz to see. "My mom," she said quietly, reaching out her hand. "Please give it back." "Please?" Bree mocked, holding the photo higher. "I think we need to teach our friend some manners about asking nicely." She made a show of examining the photo more closely, then looked back at Izzy with a calculating expression. "You know what? I think I'll keep this for a while. Maybe show it around. Let everyone know what a mama's girl we've got here." "Give it back," Izzy said, her voice carrying a warning that made Kayla and Jazz exchange glances. For just a moment, something had shifted in Izzy's demeanor. A subtle change in posture, a different quality to her stillness. Bree either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Or what?" she challenged, waving the photo tauntingly. "You gonna tell the principal? Call your mummy to come rescue you?" Izzy took a step forward, and suddenly the air in the hallway felt different. Jazz's hand moved instinctively towards her belt buckle, and Kayla straightened up from her casual lean against the wall. Something about Izzy's movement had triggered their predator instincts, warning them that the prey might not be as defenseless as they'd assumed. But Bree was too invested in the performance to back down now. With a deliberate motion, she tore the photo in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor around Izzy's scattered belongings. "Oops," Bree said with exaggerated innocence. Looks like there was an accident. Izzy stared down at the torn pieces of the photo, feeling something snap inside her chest. The image had been taken last summer, during one of the few times her mother had been able to take a real vacation. Her mother had insisted on the picture, saying she wanted to remember the moment when they'd both felt truly happy. When Izzy looked up, Bree took an involuntary step backward. The quiet, submissive girl from the library was gone, replaced by someone with cold, hard eyes and the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. "You shouldn't have done that," Izzy said softly. "Yeah." Bree recovered her bravado quickly, stepping back into Izzy's personal space. "What are you going to do about it, Greenie?" "Cry?" Izzy bent down and began picking up her scattered belongings, her movements careful and deliberate. She gathered the torn pieces of the photograph and tucked them into her pocket, then methodically repacked her messenger bag. The three bullies watched her with growing confusion, unsure why their victim wasn't reacting the way they expected. "That's right," Kayla said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Clean up your mess like a good little girl." Izzy stood slowly, slinging her bag over her shoulder. When she looked at Bree again, her expression was completely neutral. "I'll see you after school," she said simply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jazz demanded, but Izzy was already walking away, heading towards the exit doors with steady, measured steps. Bree called after her, "Hey, we're not done here!" But Izzy didn't turn around or acknowledge the shout. She pushed through the doors and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the three bullies standing in the hallway with a vague feeling that something had just shifted in their carefully controlled dynamic. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly for Izzy. She walked back to the small apartment she shared with her mother, ate a quiet dinner, and completed her homework with mechanical precision. Her mother asked about her day, and she gave her the standard okay response that teenagers had perfected for generations. Her mother didn't press for details, though Izzy caught her studying her face with the concerned expression parents developed when they suspected their children were struggling. That evening, Izzy stood in front of her bedroom mirror and stretched, her muscles loose and ready. Her body remembered the movements perfectly, the stances, the blocks, the way to redirect an opponent's force. Muscle memory was a powerful thing, and despite months of inactivity, Izzy felt her reflexes sharpening with each repetition. The self-defense studio had found her by chance during her family's time in Chicago. Izzy had been harassed by some older boys near her apartment when an older woman named Maria Sanchez had intervened. Maria had been a martial arts instructor for years and had offered to teach Izzy how to defend herself. What had begun as self-defense lessons had evolved into something much more intense. Izzy discovered she had a natural aptitude for combat, a fierce determination, and most importantly, the ability to remain calm under pressure. Within 6 months, she was sparring regularly with advanced students and learning techniques that went far beyond basic self-defense. Within a year, she had developed into a skilled and confident fighter. But the self-defense world also came with risks. There were injuries, demanding training schedules, and the constant pressure to push herself beyond her limits. When her family moved to their current location, Izzy had made the decision to focus on school and put her training on hold. She told herself she could survive high school by keeping a low profile and avoiding confrontation. Bree Harding had made that strategy impossible. Izzy spent an hour working through her training routine, practicing punches and kicks in the small space between her bed and desk. She visualized different scenarios, anticipating potential attacks and rehearsing her responses. She knew that she couldn't afford to underestimate her opponents, even if they seemed like typical high school bullies. The next morning at school, Izzy could sense the change in atmosphere immediately. Word had spread about the incident in the hallway, and students were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be waiting for a show, but all of them knew that something was brewing. Bree's crew was even more aggressive than usual, emboldened by their perceived victory the day before. They made a point of blocking Izzy's path in the hallways, forcing her to walk around them while they made snide remarks about her clothes, her hair, and her general appearance. During lunch, they occupied her usual spot on the library floor, forcing her to eat, standing up near the bookshelves. "Looking a little stressed there, Greenie," Kayla commented as Izzy passed their group on her way to return a book. "You sleep okay last night? Maybe you were having nightmares about torn photographs." Izzy didn't respond, but several students at nearby tables had stopped studying to listen. The tension in the library was becoming palpable, and even some of the librarians were starting to notice. "I heard her mommy called the school," Jazz added loudly enough for half the library to hear. "Wanted to complain about kids being mean to her precious daughter." This wasn't true, but truth had never been a concern for bullies. The lie would spread through the school's rumor mill within hours, adding another layer of humiliation to Izzy's growing reputation as a target. "That's enough," came a voice from across the library. Everyone turned to see David Chen, a senior who served as student council president and generally commanded respect from both students and faculty. He was walking towards their group with a determined expression that suggested he'd finally decided to intervene. "Stay out of this, Chen," Bree warned, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. David had the kind of social standing that could make life difficult for bullies if he chose to make an issue of their behavior. "No," David said firmly, stopping directly beside Izzy. "I won't stay out of it. What you're doing is pathetic, and everyone knows it." For a moment, Izzy felt a surge of hope that someone was finally willing to stand up to Bree's crew. But she also knew that David's intervention would only make things worse in the long run. Bullies didn't respond well to public shame, and they would take their anger out on her once there were no witnesses around. "Thanks," Izzy said quietly to David, "but it's okay. I can handle it." David looked at her with surprise and disappointment. "You don't have to handle it alone," he said. "There are people who will help if you just ask." But Izzy was already walking away, leaving David standing beside Bree's group with a frustrated expression. She knew he meant well, but he didn't understand the dynamics at play. Bree's crew wouldn't be deterred by social pressure or administrative intervention. They would only be stopped by someone willing to meet them on their own terms. The final showdown came that afternoon as Izzy was leaving school. She deliberately stayed late in the art room, hoping Bree's crew would give up waiting and go home. But as she stepped out of the main entrance of Crestwood Academy, she saw them strategically positioned around the courtyard. Bree was leaning against a statue near the sidewalk, while Kayla and Jazz had stationed themselves to block the main path. Other students were leaving in clusters, heading towards buses and cars with the carefree chatter of teenagers whose biggest worry was weekend plans. A few noticed the arrangement of Bree's crew and quickened their pace, instinctively avoiding what looked like an impending confrontation. Izzy adjusted her messenger bag and started walking towards the street, hoping to circle around the courtyard and evade the encounter. But Bree pushed off from the statue and called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, Greenie, we need to chat." Izzy kept walking, but she could hear footsteps behind her as all three bullies fell into step. The courtyard was emptying quickly as students sensed trouble and made themselves scarce. Within minutes, the area around the school entrance was deserted except for Izzy and her pursuers. "I said we need to chat," Bree repeated, her voice carrying the threat that suggested the talking stage was nearly over. Izzy reached the sidewalk and turned to face them. The three bullies had spread out in a semicircle, cutting off her escape routes and positioning themselves for maximum intimidation. They looked confident, relaxed even, like predators who had cornered their prey. "What do you want?" Izzy asked, though she already knew the answer. "What do I want?" Bree laughed, but there was no amusement in it. "I want you to realize something, Seattle. Yesterday, you humiliated me in front of half the library. You walked away when I was speaking to you, and you made me look weak. I didn't humiliate anyone, Izzy said calmly. I just picked up my stuff and left. See, that's where you're wrong, Kayla interjected, cracking her knuckles in preparation. When Queen Bree's talking to you, you listen until she's finished. That's how respect operates. Jazz stepped closer, close enough that Izzy could smell the artificial vanilla of her perfume. We tried to be nice, she said. We tried to teach you the rules the easy way. But I guess you need a harsher lesson. Izzy felt the familiar calm washing over her, the same focused state she'd entered before every sparring match at the self-defense studio. Her breathing slowed, her senses sharpened, and her awareness expanded to take in every detail of her surroundings. 3 opponents, spread out but inexperienced. They were accustomed to intimidating victims, not fighting trained fighters. Bree was the leader but likely the weakest physically. Kayla was tall but uncoordinated, favoring her left side. Jazz was the most dangerous, built like a wrestler with calloused knuckles that suggested some real fighting experience. Last chance, Greenie, Bree said, taking off her designer jacket and tossing it aside. Get on your knees, apologize for disrespecting me, and maybe we'll just roughen you up a little. Keep acting tough, and we'll put you in the hospital. Izzy slowly shrugged off her messenger bag, setting it down carefully on the sidewalk. The motion was deliberate, methodical, and something about it made Kayla take a half step backward. You sure you want to do this? Izzy asked, her voice carrying a new quality that none of them had heard before. It wasn't fear or pleading. It was the quiet conviction of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. What's that supposed to mean? Jazz demanded. But her eyes were studying Izzy with new attention, picking up on subtle changes in posture and positioning. Izzy straightened up from placing her bag down, and when she looked at them again, the transformation was complete. The quiet, submissive girl they'd been terrorizing was gone, replaced by someone with the predatory stillness of a trained fighter. It means, Izzy said softly, you picked the wrong girl. Bree lunged first, throwing a sloppy slap that telegraphed itself from yards away. Izzy evaded the slap easily, stepping inside Bree's guard and delivering a swift kick to her stomach that doubled her over. As Bree gasped for air, Izzy grabbed her arm and used her momentum to throw her into the nearby statue. Bree hit the stone with a loud thud and slumped to the ground, dazed and clutching her head. Kayla and Jazz rushed her simultaneously, but Izzy had anticipated the coordinated attack. She sidestepped Kayla's charge, grabbed her extended arm, and used her momentum to twist her wrist, sending her sprawling to the ground in pain. Jazz was more cautious, circling with her hands up in a basic boxing stance that suggested some real training. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, looking at Bree's motionless form with shock and growing fear. Izzy didn't answer. Instead, she moved forward with fluid grace, feinting high before delivering a powerful knee to Jazz's thigh. The larger girl stumbled, and Izzy followed up with a spinning back kick that connected with her jaw, sending her crashing into a nearby bench. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Izzy stood in the middle of the sidewalk, barely winded, looking down at 3 bullies who had learned the difference between intimidating victims and fighting someone who knew how to defend herself. Bree was semi-conscious, moaning softly and holding her head. Kayla was still on the ground, cradling her wrist. Jazz had slid off the bench and was sitting on the grass, spitting blood and clutching her jaw. "Listen carefully," Izzy said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This ends now. You don't talk to me, you don't look at me, and you sure as hell don't touch me or my stuff ever again. If I hear about you bothering anyone else the way you bothered me, I'll find you and we'll have another chat. Do you understand?" Jazz nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving Izzy's face. Kayla managed a whimpered yes from her position on the ground. Bree was still too dazed to respond coherently. Izzy picked up her messenger bag and walked away, leaving the 3 bullies in various states of consciousness and injury on the sidewalk behind her. As she reached the corner, she could hear Jazz helping Bree to her feet and Kayla groaning about needing to go to the emergency room. The next morning at Crestwood Academy, Izzy walked through the front doors wearing the same green jacket, but everything else had changed. Students parted to let her pass, some with obvious respect, others with nervous glances that suggested word of the courtyard confrontation had spread quickly through the school's rumor mill. Bree's crew was nowhere to be seen during first period, and by lunchtime, rumors were circulating that they'd all called in sick. Izzy ate her lunch at her usual spot on the library floor, but this time, no one bothered her. In fact, several students made a point of nodding respectfully as they passed, including David Chen, who stopped to tell her he was glad she'd finally stood up for herself. When Bree, Kayla and Jazz finally returned to school 3 days later, they were noticeably different. Bree had a bandage on her head, Kayla had a sling on her arm, and Jazz moved gingerly as if her jaw was still aching. They made no attempt to re-establish their previous dominance, instead giving Izzy a wide berth and avoiding eye contact whenever their paths crossed. The transformation in Izzy was just as significant, but in a different way. She still wore her green jacket and kept mostly to herself, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. She'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to meet them on their own terms, but she'd also made sure not to become what she'd fought against. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the courtyard incident, Izzy was approached by a younger student who was clearly being targeted by some older girls. The girl was hesitant, stuttering, as she asked if Izzy might be willing to help her deal with some bullies who were making her life miserable. Izzy listened to the story, recognized the familiar pattern of systematic intimidation, and agreed to have a conversation with the bullies in question. The conversation was short and effective, and the younger student's problems vanished immediately. Word spread quickly that Izzy Moreau was someone who defended people who couldn't defend themselves. She never sought out confrontations, never used her skills to intimidate or threaten, but everyone at Crestwood Academy understood that she was not someone to be messed with. By the time graduation arrived, Izzy had earned something she'd never experienced at any of her previous schools: genuine respect from her peers and a reputation as someone who protected others rather than preying on them. She'd learned that strength without compassion was just another form of bullying, but that sometimes the only language bullies understood was force. The quiet girl in the green jacket had taught Crestwood Academy a valuable lesson about the danger of assumptions, and 3 former bullies had learned that picking on the wrong person could have consequences they never expected. 54,103 characters.